positions because theirs were much broader. At Midzensk on the 4th of October, T-34s operated in large numbers for the first time, inflicting heavy casualties on the Panzer IIIs of the 4th Panzer Division. Guderian was later to comment that it was at the Battle of Midzensk that for the first time the vast superiority of the T-34 became plainly apparent to the Germans. And when Typhoon finally ground to an exhausted halt at the beginning of December, large numbers of T-34s belonging to the fresh divisions entrained from Siberia led the Soviet counteroffensive in front of Moscow on December the 5th, 1941. By then it had become apparent to the German army that it had to take steps to address the clear technological superiority in tank design possessed by the Soviets and represented in the T-34. In October, a Panzer Commission met with General Heinz Guderian at Orel in Russia to consider ways of responding to the T-34, in addition to continuing development of the heavy Tiger tank. The decision was taken to proceed with production of a new medium Panzer under the designation VK3002, contracts for which were issued within days of the return to Germany. The initially favoured design from Daimler-Benz clearly reflected the influence of the T-34, with heavily sloping armour and turret mounted far forward on the hull. On May 15, 1942, Hitler acceded to the recommendations of a report that favoured production of the alternative design submission from the MAN company. The prototype MAN Panther incorporated the many changes foisted on the design team in the course of the new Panzer's development. Weight had grown to 45 tons, and the tank now mounted the longer and more formidable 75mm L-70 gun. Contracts were issued in September 1942 for 1,000 Panthers, with the first leaving the MAN works in January 1943. Parallel production lines were set up with Daimler-Benz, MNH, and are seen in this still at Henschel of Kassel. It was at the latter concern that a very brief glimpse of one of the new Panther medium tanks, seen just beyond the target in the foreground, was captured on newsreel in May 1943. The new Panther had a very short gestation period, from drawing board to production line in just over a year. There was much optimism that this new tank would provide the Panzerwaffe with the technical edge on the Eastern Front it had hitherto lacked. The first model of the Panther was the Type D, identifiable by its drum-type commander's cupola with lid hatch and machine gun flap on the left side of the glacis. In other respects, such as armour thickness, it was to remain the same on all preceding models. 80mm for the frontal plate, 120mm for the gun mantlet, and 40mm on the sides. The early Model A mounted a new turret with a cast cupola with 7 periscopes. The later A saw the introduction of the machine gun ball mount in the glacis. Introduced in March 1944 was the G, which was to remain in production until war's end. The combat debut of the Panther during Operation Citadel in July 1943 was decidedly inauspicious. This last German offensive in the east was meant to be a limited affair, fought over a very restricted geographical area and rapidly concluded. But in terms of the actual number of tanks and forces allocated, it was a major commitment of scarce resources at a time when the scope of the war was widening dramatically. In part, it was to address this quandary that Citadel was launched. The task of the offensive was to destroy the great Soviet salient at Kursk and eliminate the vast Soviet forces therein, thus shortening the front line and freeing up Panzer divisions for transfer to the west to deal with the expected Allied landings on the mainland of Europe. Originally planned for the spring, Citadel was repeatedly delayed to allow for adequate numbers of Ferdinand assault guns and Tiger and Panther tanks to be assembled. For Hitler believed that only with their presence in sizable numbers could a favourable outcome to the battle be assured. No footage exists of the approximately 200 Panthers committed to the offensive. Organised into tank battalions 51 and 52, and under the command of Major von Lauchert, The Panther Regiment was subordinated to the Grossdeutschland Division during Citadel. On paper, the Panther Regiment represented the most powerful armoured unit at Kursk, but its effectiveness was to be severely inhibited by its premature commitment to battle. Although raised at the beginning of 1943, the two battalions suffered so many problems with their Panthers that most of them were returned to the factories for overhaul or rebuilding. Guderian, now Inspector General of Armoured Troops, called the Panther our problem child, for it was a maintenance nightmare, the inevitable fruits of a very hasty development and production schedule. Even the crews did not receive the time to fully train on their new charges. 5 days into the offensive, there were only 10 Panthers operational. Although just 25 had been destroyed, 100 had broken down. While the frontal armour had proven effective, the 40mm side armour was shown to be vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank fire, many Panthers being lost in this fashion. Nevertheless, the 75mm gun was shown to be highly effective, destroying T-34s at 3,000 metres. As the production tempo increased, more Panther battalions were being raised and hastily deployed to combat the growing power of the Red Army, which, having wrested the military initiative at Kursk, was in the months after the battle pushing the Germans back all along the southern part of the front. By October, there were 5 Army and SS Panther battalions in action in Russia, with others coming on stream in November. The furious pace of operations and continuing technical problems led to high losses, and of the total of 841 Panthers deployed to the Eastern Front in 1943, only 80 out of an available 217 were actually operational on December the 31st, some 624 machines having been lost in combat since July. Nevertheless, it was only in March of 1944 that Guderian declared the Panther fully combat capable.